everyone. I'm Cassie Adams, Care Services Director for the ALS Association, Oregon and Southwest Washington chapter. And I'm so glad you're watching today. Today we're hosting another live educational event with the purpose of sharing information and strategies for preserving the independence and quality of life for people living with ALS and their support team. Today we're joined by ALS Association board member Jason Drucker and Vallie and Peter Marana. And today's conversation will really focus on how Vallie and her family live with ALS and how they've had to adapt and redefine what their lives look like after the ALS diagnosis. Just a few housekeeping items. Today's live stream will be recorded for later viewing on our YouTube page and our website. And we encourage you, if you have comments or you have questions for any of the speakers today, you may put those into the Facebook comments bar, and we'll do our best to answer your questions live. And without further ado, I'd like to take a moment just to introduce Jason Drucker, who is one of our fantastic board members with our chapter. And he's going to be conducting an interview with Vallie and Peter today. Jason, could you start off by just sharing a little bit about yourself?
Sure, I'd love to. Thanks, Cassie. And thank you, Peter and Vallie. I'm looking forward to getting to know you even better today. So my journey with ALS started with my father and a diagnosis several years ago. And the reality of the entire family living with ALS is something that we went through. I was struck by my father's journey to diagnosis and how many diseases or conditions have a very quick test or a fast path to diagnosis. And ALS is characterized as a much more difficult path. And I'd like to talk to you about that today. But first, Peter and Vallie, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, we now live in Bend, Oregon. We had been down in Austin, Texas for about 10 years. And prior to that, I'd been in the Bay Area for a long time. Vallie's health issues, particularly when we were down in Austin, were kind of focused on her breathing. And we've been to cardiologists, we've been to pulmonologists, they've done lots of tests. And what you mentioned earlier was that there was not a diagnosis. There was lots of problems, but nobody could seem to nail it down. And then Vallie said, gee, let's just go down to UCSF. And so we went down there in October, had an appointment with the head of lung transplants at UCSF. And literally the first day that we were there, they sent her off to have a pulmonary function test. And I went to lunch and I came back and she was in the ICU. Her blood CO2 was so high that they just admitted her directly, and she spent 10 days in the ICU at UCSF. Initially, the focus was, again, the blood CO2, and they had her on all kinds of sophisticated ventilators. But even they just couldn't, what's going on? Why is your breathing so weak? And they brought over some neurologists from the ALS Clinic at UCSF. And we still have Zoom calls with the neurologists that did the diagnosis part, but they did an EMG and a muscle biopsy. And those came back and said neuromuscular disease. So, but we spent October and November in and out of UCSF, going to doing all kinds of tests, and then came home, and then Vallie was on a ventilator but a mask, which still wasn't working well, and she got a trach in mid-March, and her health has improved dramatically from that.
Awesome. You talk about the experience at UCSF and how that was really like the light bulb that kind of led to, effective treatment and support. But what were some of the initial symptoms that led to the kind of misdiagnosis on the way to UCSF?
Well, the blood CO2 thing was just chronic. Yeah, and she was diagnosed with COPD, and
right.
The pulmonologist down at UCSF goes, no, your tissues in your lungs are real healthy. We know we have a problem, but that's not it. and they thought she had a frozen diaphragm. And again, this is all good faith. People were working very hard to get, this nailed down. But as you mentioned earlier, ALS is, somewhat rare and not where people go. I mean, meaning physicians. And but we have we have very, very good nephrologist here, very sharp guy. And I'm not making this up, his twin brother is a pulmonologist in Phoenix and runs a large private clinic. And so we flew down to get an analysis from him. And he was the first one that brought up the issue. He didn't diagnose it, but he said, you know what, I just don't understand what's going on. So
it's interesting, right? You had to be relentless. I mean, they're fantastic physicians and healthcare professionals, but it really is when you get into a center of excellence or into the ALS community that I feel like the light bulbs start to go off. They see the same problems, but different root causes, and it's amazing how you can just like click over from feeling like you're wandering on your own trying to find something, and you find the right person that kind of connects the dots. How long do you think it took from just the initial symptoms that led to COPD before you guys were at UCSF?
Year and a half.
Year and a half.
More. Huh? Several years, really. Because, it starts off slowly.
Yes. I think that's incredible. I appreciate you sharing that with the audience today, because I know there will be people watching that are either newly diagnosed or are on their own journey of discovery and trying to connect dots. And it can be very difficult. You just don't get answers. You think you have an answer and then it shifts. So that knowing that that's a process that many people go through is important. I realize we went right into the meat of our conversation, but how long have you guys been married?
Well, we got married in 1975.
1975. Amazing.
Yeah. So 45 years.
So I know it's 45 years because I'm 46. So it's 1 year younger than me.
Yeah. And we have 2 kids in their 30s. And I'm sure everybody goes through some variation of this. Our son moved back in July.
Okay.
And as a caregiver, I mean, you're doing the heavy lifting and you try not to whine too much. And having him in the house now has been such a blessing. One is his attitude, but he puts away the dishes.
Yes.
I mean, I gotta tell you, he cooks dinner every other night. I mean, you forget how much work you're doing if you're kind of mostly the single person handling all this stuff. So that has been just terrific. Our daughter and son-in-law and their 2 little kids lived in the Bay Area, and they came up 2 weeks ago and rented a house about 20 miles south in Sun River. And that was just perfect. We got our van now, so Vallie just drives up into the van and we can go down there, and we spend a lot of time with them.
That's fantastic. Having the family close sounds like a wonderful legacy, wonderful to spend time together in all situations. Peter, you touched on becoming a caregiver and the different roles that exist as a caregiver. And sometimes that means going shopping, and sometimes that means direct healthcare. Talk to us a little bit about your experience as a caregiver through this journey.
Well, it's a lot, but part of it is that I know Vallie would be doing it for me, and I know it makes her day better. I just, I realize that it's more work, but it's not really more work. It just needs to be done, and I've gotten more organized. I need to tell you that kind of folding up the towels and cleaning the potty regularly is important.
Yes.
You're not 12 and you could put it off and mom and dad will eventually do it.
Right.
So you adjust. I mean, this whole thing is an adjustment, and changes, at least our experience with ALS, are continuous, but they're pretty small. And yeah, I don't know. You just you figure out ways to make it work. Well, yeah, but I don't know.
It sounds like you're have the right approach. You're systemizing what needs to be systemized. You're making constant adjustments proactively. Every day is a new day in life in general, and even more so when you're living with ALS. But it's wonderful to hear that your families come up and help, and everybody can pitch in different ways. And
yeah.
I'm sure you're finding that people are coming out of the woodwork at times to help out.
It's been I don't know, just remarkable how many people stay in touch. And our daughter organized some kind of fundraiser that was related to the walk last week, and raised a kind of a remarkable amount of money.
That's great.
You know, so.
Yeah, that's great. That is great. You know, we find ourselves in such interesting times. The walk, which we participated in as well, was a virtual event this year. We find ourselves in doing a lot of things virtually because of the impact of COVID. How has that impacted you and the family?
That's interesting. We were kind of quarantined before the pandemic.
Right.
You know, so I'm not even sure. I mean, it was important for us regarding safety of Vallie. And so for her to have gotten COVID would be terribly serious. And when Matt first moved here, he had COVID.
Oh, wow.
And you know, we have a house where there's a front kind of study, and he stayed there and watched TV, and his bedroom's upstairs. And we were real careful with all of that. And, you know, 2 weeks went by and he was asymptomatic. And then, you know, it was like, okay. Kind of exhale. But, you know, Vallie's going to have a surgical procedure tomorrow. And the St. Charles health system here insists that you get a COVID test 7 days prior to going into the hospital for any kind of attention.
Right.
So.
Wow. Well, it sounds like you guys are tackling this one head on too. Just right when you think it can't get more difficult, we get a pandemic at the same time. You talked about the ALS Clinic, Peter, when you guys were at UCSF, and this is still a relatively recent support structure in the ALS community. Maybe talk about the ALS Clinic that you guys use locally in Bend, Oregon.
Yeah, it's been very good. Dr. Ugaldi here is sort of the local ALS specialist. And then there's Dr. Bleckman, who runs Partners in Care, but it's a palliative care service group. And we're under home health from St. Charles. So there's a lot of care. And these, our experience is that they're all very experienced and kind of caring people. Oh yeah, and that they've, you know, COVID shut them down for a while, but every 2 months you go over to where Dr. Ugaldi practices, and you're there for a couple hours, and they kind of rotate people through. So, you know, we had I bet it was almost an hour with Dr. Ugaldi and Dr. Bleckman, and then the speech therapist came in, and then the RT came in, and a couple of other people. So
this is a wonderful,
intense or focused session.
This is a wonderful structure. I mean, the idea of having to, you know, hopscotch around the medical establishment to get the care that's needed. So frankly, just the logistics is wonderful, but also the coordination between those professionals to really be recognizing where you are today and meeting you is fantastic. That's been an area of focus for the ALS Association for a long time, and it's something that we personally benefited from. I'm so happy that you are as well. One of the things that's most challenging immediately upon diagnosis is, you know, what support is going to be the most impactful? How do I navigate the early days? You talked about some of the systemization that you've put in place for care. You have you're in the flow now. But what was the most helpful support early on as you were learning the challenges that you were facing?
Bleckman? Yeah. Dr. Bleckman was sort of first on the scene. And she's got some special training in palliative care, and their group is real professional. And actually, we kind of cruised over an issue that I'd like to back up on for just a second. When you get that diagnosis, you don't know anything. Other than just being kind of overwhelmed, I guess. You don't know about ALS specialists and respiratory therapists, and there's just this really gold mine of resources, but you don't know about it.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think that even in the medical establishment, we talked about how people with the same titles, say a neurologist, if they don't have a practice focused on ALS, you end up getting kind of tracked down, maybe a different discovery. And that's important, I know, because like you said, ALS is a rarer disease. But if you're able to get to the right people at the right time, and behind those diagnostic clinicians is an army of support ready to kind of spring into action and help. And you're now a part of that. And being with us today here is part of that for families that are on day one of this journey. So if you were speaking to them today, what would you give what advice would you give to the families that are in that first day, week, month of their journey with living with ALS?
Probably to get plugged in with the ALS Association, just as fast as they can, to write down as many questions as they can think of. But they have to identify the specialists that have some depth and experience with ALS. And they probably don't, insurance can be quite complex. And, I'm just looking back on, we've been to the hospital a lot, but all the business with the ventilator and the trach, and then the walker, and then the wheelchair, and then the power chair, and the van, and we have a Hoyer lift. Geez, and we have, the term is DME, but durable medical equipment, but they're the people that provide all of the related gear.
Yes.
The people that here, it's called Norco, in Bend, have just been wonderful. I mean, we appreciating not everybody's going to have a trach and things, but a stupid little suction thing that all of a sudden, they're not lasting a week. I sent a text this morning, and 6 of them showed up in a box on our porch.
That's great.
Today.
In some of the interactions I've had with families with ALS, they sometimes feel like, I don't need the support, or they delay accessing something new. And it sounds like you guys are doing a fantastic job of getting the right equipment at the right time to facilitate the highest quality of life possible.
Yeah.
Is that?
Well, and we're starting the eye gaze thing. And, I'm a little overwhelmed by it, but we'll like all this technology, and you'll get up to speed. And Vallie, just by moving her eyes,
yeah,
is going to be able to go to the internet and send emails and read them, and
that's fantastic. One of the things that that we hear continuously from families that are newly diagnosed is the challenge of essentially sharing that news with family and friends. How did you guys navigate that difficult conversation?
Yeah, it wasn't that difficult because Vallie's health issues had been so serious for so long. I wouldn't say it was a relief, but her health was deteriorating. That wasn't, the family. And so when all of a sudden it was nailed down, at least you kind of knew what you're dealing with.
Yes.
It sounds kind of weird to say it that way, but Well, yeah, I know some people don't want to talk about it, but you're going to be very surprised with your friends and your family. And across the board, everybody that we've talked to or brought this up with have been 100% supportive.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That little fundraiser. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Vallie said that she just didn't know how many people cared that deeply.
Yes.
The fundraiser that our daughter did, 64 people contributed.
Wow, that's fantastic. It reminds me as you're navigating those conversations that you, especially as you think back to when you were raising children in their young years, you think that your job is to shelter them from the world, but it's actually to prepare them for the world. And one thing that I loved about the end of my father's life was that we had an opportunity to have conversations about that. And I felt prepared. I felt he prepared me to go through that journey, and it sounds like you guys are doing that as well. One of the things for us that was important too was um, the what gave us meaning and hope. Like we had every day, we wanted to be striving for something. What gives you guys meaning and hope while you're living with ALS?
Oh, the grandkids would probably be at top of the list.
That's wonderful. Yeah. And I'm sorry, you said your grandkids are now local. They're in Sun River, or are they just
No, they're down in
coming up?
They're down in the Bay Area.
Bay Area. Okay.
So we've got a 2.5-year-old and a 5-month-old. So a real young family. But we have our daughter and son-in-law work for Facebook. And so we have a Facebook portal that they gave us.
Awesome.
It's kind of a upgraded Zoom, to be honest with you. But it's fun it's remarkably high resolution.
And it's on your TV, right? So that's helpful.
Well, it's a standalone monitor.
Oh, it's a standalone one. Okay.
Room. I don't know how it does that.
Huh.
But, those kinds of things help a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so one of the toughest things to be on the interviewer side, Peter and Vallie, is I may have missed some questions. So we have a bit more time. What have we not talked about today that either you'd like to talk about or are aspects of your journey together that we haven't covered?
Oh, yeah. Vallie said that it's important to get emotional support, counseling, that kind of thing, which we're doing. And it's just somebody's just approaching you from not necessarily a medical angle, but your emotional and spiritual health. And they ask questions which, to be honest with you, are tough to answer. But they need to be, all that stuff needs to be discussed.
Well, I will tell you that we're starting to get comments into our Facebook feed. And so I just wanted to let you know, Peter, that your daughter Claire has given a wonderful shout out to you and said that you are a phenomenal caregiver. And so I'm sure at times it can feel like a thankless job, but it is being recognized and appreciated. So I'm very, very proud to be able to pass that on to you.
Thanks.
And Vallie, I know it's difficult to speak, but I would say, what would you say to someone that had just been recently diagnosed?
It takes time to register.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah, to seek support. And let yourself cry.
Yeah, that seems fair. If I could just be so bold as to add one thing to it, is that life is full of lots of turns and twists, and it can have meaning in all sorts of different versions. And so as a board member of ALS Association, I've had an opportunity to interact with a number of families living with ALS, living wonderful lives. And it may be a modified life, but it can be a wonderful life. And so I have no doubt that you two are living a wonderful life. And I don't mean that to take anything away from the challenges on a day-to-day basis, but I have enjoyed getting to know you and consider my life richer for having spent time with you guys. So I'm thankful for that. Okay, Peter, Vallie, any parting shots, parting comments? I think we covered some good ground.
Yeah, get in touch with the ALS Association. You know, you don't need to be alone. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. There are resources out there that you don't even know exist. And you know, and make the most of every day.
Yeah. You know, I think that's great advice. And I think as far as connecting with the ALS Association, not to just give a plug, but I found that my first instinct was to go to Google and to do all the research myself. And I'm gonna figure this out. But there are people that have spent their whole careers figuring it out. They can translate it for you. They can put it into maybe an organization that works for you. I think that's really great advice. There's definitely a lot of capacity in wanting to help. Okay. Well, Vallie and Peter, thank you so much for the time today. I really appreciate that. And we'll speak to you soon.
Okay, thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.